Betty wiped down the last table in the community center's main hall, her worn cloth moving in the same steady circle she'd been making for the past 8 years. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that she knew every crack and stain of by heart. At 52, Betty had become as much a fixture of the Riverside Community Center as the mismatched chairs and the flickering, fluorescent light in the corner that nobody ever seemed to get around to fixing. She moved quietly through her routine, emptying trash bins and straightening chairs that would be knocked askew again tomorrow. The evening volunteer meeting was starting in an hour, and Betty always made sure everything was perfect before the regulars arrived. Not that anyone really noticed her work, but that was fine by her. She'd learned long ago that being invisible had its advantages. The other volunteers were nice enough. They'd nod and say hello when they saw her, ask about her day or comment on the weather. But Betty could see it in their eyes, that look people get when they're being polite to someone they consider part of the background. She was the cleaning lady, the quiet woman who kept things tidy and never caused any trouble. And that was perfectly okay with her. What they didn't know, what nobody in this small town knew, was that Betty's hands held memories of a different life entirely. These same hands that now pushed a mop and arranged folding chairs had once danced across piano keys with the grace of someone born to make music. But that was 30 years ago. In what felt like another lifetime, Betty had been 22 when she'd received the letter that changed everything. The acceptance to the New England Conservatory had been everything she'd dreamed of since she was 7 years old and first touched the keys of her grandmother's old upright piano. Her music teacher had called her gifted, said she had something special that couldn't be taught. The conservatory agreed, offering her a full scholarship that would have opened doors to a world of concert halls and recording studios. But then her mother got sick. Really sick. And her father, who'd never been much for handling stress, started drinking more and working less. Betty's younger brother was only 16 and needed someone to make sure he graduated high school. The family needed her, and the conservatory couldn't wait. So she made the choice that would define the rest of her life. She stayed home, took a job at the local diner, and watched her dreams get smaller and smaller until they fit into the tiny box she'd built around her heart. The years passed in a blur of responsibilities and small sacrifices. She married her high school sweetheart, had 2 beautiful children, and when her husband left when the kids were still young, she did what she'd always done. She figured out how to make it work. The diner job became a cleaning job because it paid better and the hours were more flexible. Piano lessons became a luxury she couldn't afford, both in time and money. Eventually, she had to sell her grandmother's piano to help pay for her daughter's emergency surgery. Now, as she arranged the last row of chairs, Betty's eyes drifted to the newest addition to the community center's collection of random furniture. In the corner, pushed against the wall like an afterthought, sat an old upright piano that had been donated just last week. It was clearly past its prime. The wood was scratched and faded, and even from across the room, Betty could see that several of the keys were either missing or stuck in the down position. She found herself walking toward it, drawn by a pull she hadn't felt in decades. The piano bench was wobbly and made a concerning creaking sound as she sat down, but she ignored it. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not quite touching them, as if she was afraid they might burn her. Up close, the damage was even worse than she'd thought. At least a dozen keys were completely unresponsive, and several others produced sounds that were more like groans than musical notes. For just a moment, Betty allowed herself to remember what it felt like to create something beautiful. She remembered the weight of the keys under her fingers, the way a perfectly played chord could make her whole body vibrate with joy. She remembered the feeling of being completely absorbed in a piece of music, losing track of time and everything else around her. But then the sound of voices in the hallway snapped her back to reality. The volunteers were arriving for their meeting, and she had work to finish. Betty quickly stood up from the piano bench and hurried back to her cleaning supplies. She had no business sitting at that piano anyway. That part of her life was over, had been over for so long that sometimes she wondered if she'd imagined the whole thing. The volunteers filed in one by one, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd been working together for years. There was Dorothy, the retired teacher who organized the food drive every Christmas. Frank, the former construction worker who handled all the maintenance requests. Linda, the bank manager who kept track of all the center's finances. They were good people, all of them, dedicated to making their community a better place. Betty finished wiping down the last counter and began packing up her supplies. She usually left before the meeting started, but tonight Dorothy called out to her. "Betty, honey, you don't have to rush off. Why don't you stay for a few minutes? We're just discussing the volunteer appreciation dinner next month." Betty paused, her hand on the door handle. She'd been invited to these meetings before, but had never stayed. It wasn't that she didn't want to help, she just figured they had everything under control, and she wasn't much for speaking up in groups. "Anyway, I don't want to interrupt," Betty said, her voice quiet as always. "You wouldn't be interrupting at all," Frank said with a smile. "You're here more than any of us. Might as well have a say in what we're doing." Betty found herself nodding and taking a seat in the back row. The discussion was mostly about logistics, how many people to expect, what kind of food to serve, who would handle decorations. But then Linda brought up a problem that had everyone looking concerned. "The pianist we hired for entertainment just called this afternoon," Linda said, reading from her notes. "Her father's in the hospital, and she can't make it. I've called around, but everyone else is either booked or too expensive for our budget." The room fell silent as everyone tried to think of a solution. The appreciation dinner was supposed to be special, a way to thank all the volunteers who kept the community center running. But without entertainment, it would just be another potluck. Dinner in a room full of folding chairs. "What about that old piano?" Frank suggested, nodding toward the corner where the donated instrument sat. "Maybe we could get someone to play that instead." "Have you looked at that thing?" Dorothy laughed. "Half the keys don't work. It's more decoration than instrument at this point." Betty's eyes drifted to the piano again, and for just a moment, she could almost hear the music it was capable of making, even in its broken state. But she quickly pushed the thought away. That was ridiculous. She was just the cleaning lady, and that piano was just an old piece of furniture that probably belonged in a junk shop. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but the entertainment problem remained unsolved. Betty slipped out quietly while the others were still discussing possible alternatives, her mind already turning to tomorrow's cleaning schedule and the grocery shopping she needed to do on the way home. As she walked to her car, Betty couldn't shake the image of her hands on those piano keys. It was foolish, she told herself. She hadn't played seriously in 30 years. And even if she could still remember the pieces, that piano was too damaged to produce anything resembling music. But as she drove home through the quiet streets of her small town, Betty found herself humming a melody she hadn't thought about in years. It was the beginning of a Chopin nocturne, one of the pieces she'd been preparing for her conservatory audition all those years ago. The music had been sleeping in her heart all this time, waiting for the right moment to wake up. 3 weeks later, Betty arrived at the community center earlier than usual. Tonight was the volunteer appreciation dinner, and she wanted to make sure everything was perfect. The tables were already set up from the afternoon, but she knew there would be last-minute details that needed attention. She always took extra care with special events. Even though she wouldn't be staying for the dinner itself, the main hall looked different tonight. Someone had hung string lights around the room, and there were fresh flowers on each table. The broken piano in the corner had even been dusted off, though it still looked sad and forgotten against the wall. Betty had heard through the grapevine that they never found a replacement entertainer. The dinner would go on without music, which seemed fitting somehow. Nothing fancy, just good people sharing a meal together. Betty was adjusting the napkin holders on the last table when people started arriving. She could hear the familiar voices in the hallway, Dorothy's laugh, Frank's booming greeting, Linda's organized chatter about who was bringing what dish. These were her people, in a way, even though she'd never quite felt like she belonged with them. Betty, Dorothy called out as she entered the hall carrying a large casserole dish. "You're still here, good. I was hoping you'd stay for dinner tonight." "Oh, I couldn't," Betty said quickly, smoothing down her simple black dress. It was the same one she wore to church and any other occasion that required something nicer than her work clothes. "This is for the volunteers. I just clean up." "Don't be silly," Frank said, setting down a cooler full of drinks. "You volunteer more hours than any of us. If anyone deserves a nice dinner, it's you." Betty felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, even positive attention. More people were filing in now, carrying covered dishes and talking excitedly about the evening ahead. The room was filling up with the warm buzz of conversation and laughter. "I suppose I could stay for a little while," Betty said softly. "Soon." About 40 people were gathered in the decorated hall. Betty recognized most of them, volunteers, board members, and a few staff members from the community center. They were all good people who gave their time to make their small town a better place. Betty found herself seated at a table near the back, next to Mrs. Chun, who ran the after-school program, and Robert, the retired firefighter who taught safety classes. The food was delicious, and the conversation was easy and comfortable. Betty found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. She was actually enjoying herself, feeling like she belonged somewhere for the first time in a long time. After dinner, the center's director, Paul, stood up to give a short speech. He was a nice man in his 50s who'd taken over the center 2 years ago. He thanked everyone for their dedication and hard work, mentioning several volunteers by name for their special contributions. Betty was surprised and touched when he mentioned her too, praising her for keeping the center clean and welcoming. "Now," Paul said, looking around the room with a slightly embarrassed smile, "we were supposed to have entertainment tonight, but, as you all know, our pianist had a family emergency. So we're going to have to provide our own entertainment." A few people chuckled, and someone called out, "How about a sing-along?" "That's not a bad idea," Paul said, "except our piano over there is more decoration than instrument these days." All eyes turned to the old upright piano in the corner. In the soft lighting of the string lights, it looked even more sad and neglected than usual. Several keys were visibly stuck, and everyone could see the scratches and water stains on its wooden surface. "That thing's been sitting there for weeks," said George, the maintenance volunteer. "Half the keys don't even work. It's probably better suited for firewood than music." Betty felt something stir in her chest as she looked at the piano. Despite its obvious problems, she could see past the damage to the instrument underneath. It was still a piano, still capable of making music, even if it wasn't perfect. "Hey, Betty," Paul said suddenly, and Betty's heart jumped as she realized everyone was looking at her. "You've been eyeing that piano every time you clean around it. Think you could get any sound out of it?" The room erupted in good-natured laughter. Betty felt her face burning red as she realized they'd noticed her looking at the piano. She'd thought she'd been discreet, but apparently not discreet enough. "Come on, Betty," Dorothy encouraged with a warm smile. "Give it a try." "What's the worst that could happen?" "Yeah, maybe you can make it sound better than it looks," Frank added with a grin. Betty looked around the room at all the expectant faces. They weren't being mean, she realized. They were just having fun, including her in their gentle teasing. To them, she was just the quiet cleaning lady who might be able to coax some noise out of the broken piano. It was meant to be harmless entertainment. Maybe even a little comic relief. "I don't know," Betty said quietly, her voice barely audible over the chatter. "I'm not really a piano player." "Nobody expects you to be," Paul said kindly. "We're just looking for a little noise to fill the silence. Even if it sounds terrible, at least we'll have something to laugh about." More people joined in the encouragement, all of them smiling and nodding. Betty could see that they genuinely wanted her to try, not to embarrass her, but to include her in the fun. It was the kind of gentle peer pressure that comes from a group of people who care about each other. Betty's hands were trembling slightly as she stood up from her chair. The room fell into an expectant hush, with only the sound of chairs scraping as people turned to get a better view. She walked slowly toward the piano, her heart pounding in her chest. 30 years. It had been 30 years since she'd sat at a piano with the intention of playing. Her fingers hadn't touched keys with any serious purpose since she was 22. Years old. What if she'd forgotten everything? What if her hands wouldn't remember what her mind had stored away? As she approached the piano, she could hear the quiet murmur of conversation behind her. Someone was taking bets on whether she'd be able to get any sound out of it at all. Another person was joking about how they might need to call a piano tuner. After she was done with it, Betty sat down on the wobbly piano bench, trying to ignore the way it creaked under her weight. Up close, the piano looked even worse than she'd thought. The keys were yellowed with age, and she could see dust and debris. Between the cracks, several keys were stuck in the down position, and others had chips and scratches that spoke of years of neglect. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their familiar weight and texture under her fingers. The ivory was cool and smooth, despite the visible damage. For just a moment, she closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to play, really play, with passion and skill and joy. The room had grown quiet. 40 people were watching her, waiting to see what would happen next. They expected nothing more than a few random notes, maybe a simple melody if they were lucky. They had no idea that the woman sitting at the broken piano had once been good. Enough to earn a full scholarship to one of the best music schools in the country. Betty took a deep breath and let her fingers find their first position. She decided on a piece, something beautiful but not too complicated, something that could work even with the piano's limitations. Her heart was racing, but underneath the fear was something else. Something that had been sleeping for 30 years was finally waking up. The room held its breath as Betty prepared to play the broken piano that everyone thought was beyond repair. Betty's fingers trembled as they found their first position on the yellowed keys. She had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had once been as natural to her as breathing. It was beautiful enough to move people, but flexible. Enough that she could work around the piano's broken keys. At least, she hoped she could. The room behind her was completely silent now. She could feel 40 pairs of eyes watching her back, waiting for whatever sound she might produce. Some were probably expecting nothing more than a few random notes. Others might have been hoping for a simple tune they could recognize. None of them could have imagined what was about to happen. Betty pressed the first key gently, testing it. The note came out soft and slightly flat, but it was a note nonetheless. She tried another, then another, quickly mapping out which keys worked and which ones didn't. Her mind, trained so many years ago to think musically, began automatically, rearranging the piece to avoid the broken keys. Then she began to play. The first few notes of the Nocturne floated out into the room, soft and tentative. Betty's touch was gentle, almost careful, as if she was afraid the piano might break completely under her fingers. But as the melody began to take shape, something magical started to happen. The music was hauntingly beautiful, even coming from the damaged instrument. Betty's fingers seemed to remember exactly how to move, exactly how much pressure to apply to each key. She had worried that 30 years away from the piano would have made her clumsy, but instead, it was like riding a bicycle. Her hands knew what to do. Behind her, The chatter and shuffling completely stopped. The silence was so complete that Betty could hear her own breathing. She was too focused on the music to turn around, but if she had, she would have seen 40 people frozen in their chairs, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with disbelief. As Betty moved into the more complex passages of the nocturne, her confidence grew. Her fingers began to dance across the keys with increasing fluidity. When she encountered a broken key, she seamlessly adjusted the melody, making it sound like the changes were intentional, part of the original composition. The music flowed around the piano's limitations like water flowing around rocks in a stream. Mrs. Chun, who was sitting closest to Betty, felt tears forming in her eyes. She had heard this piece before, but never like this. Never played with such emotion and skill that it made her chest ache with the beauty of it. She looked around the table and saw that she wasn't the only one being affected. Robert, the tough old firefighter, was wiping his eyes with his napkin. The transformation in Betty was remarkable. The woman who had spent the evening quietly eating dinner and speaking only when spoken to was now commanding the attention of the entire room through her music. Her posture had changed. Her shoulders were straight, her head held high. There was a grace in her movements that spoke of years of training and natural talent. Dorothy, who had known Betty for 8 years, felt like she was seeing her for the first time. This wasn't the humble cleaning lady who apologized for everything and tried to make herself invisible. This was an artist, a musician of extraordinary skill who had somehow been hiding in plain sight all this time. As Betty moved through the middle section of the nocturne, the music grew more passionate and complex. Her left hand was providing a rich, deep accompaniment while her right hand sang out the melody with a clarity and expression that seemed impossible given the piano's condition. She was making the broken instrument sound whole again, bringing beauty out of something that everyone had written off as useless. Frank, who knew a little about music from his church choir days, couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just someone who could play a few songs. This was professional-level talent, the kind you heard in concert halls, not in community center dinners. He found himself leaning forward in his chair, not wanting to miss a single note. Betty was lost in the music now, completely absorbed in the piece she had once loved so much. Her eyes were closed, and her face showed an expression of pure joy, mixed with deep emotion. She was remembering what it felt like to be truly alive, to be doing what she was born to do. The years of sacrifice and quiet resignation fell away, and for these few minutes, she was 22 again, full of dreams and unlimited potential. The music seemed to fill every corner of the room. People who had been chatting and laughing just minutes before were now sitting in stunned silence, afraid to move or breathe too loudly for fear of breaking the spell. Some were crying openly now, moved by the unexpected beauty of the moment. Paul, the center director, felt goosebumps running up and down his arms. In all his years of organizing events and hiring entertainment, he had never experienced anything like this. There was something raw and honest about Betty's performance that no professional entertainer could have provided. This wasn't just music. It was a revelation. As Betty approached the final section of the nocturne, she allowed herself to play with even more emotion. This was the part of the piece that had always moved her the most, the place where the melody soared to its highest point before gently returning to earth. Her fingers found every working key they needed, and the broken ones seemed to disappear entirely, as if they had healed themselves through the power of her music. The melody began to wind down, growing softer and more delicate. Betty's touch became lighter, more careful, as she guided the piece toward its gentle conclusion. She could feel that she was coming back to reality, that this magical moment was almost over. Part of her wanted to keep playing forever, to stay in this place where she was truly herself, but all beautiful things must end. And Betty played the final soft notes of the nocturne with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to many eyes in the room. The last note hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity, and then faded into complete silence. Betty kept her hands on the keys for a moment longer, her eyes still closed, trying to hold on to the feeling of the music. She had forgotten how alive playing made her feel, how complete and whole she felt when she was making music. For 30 years, she had pushed this part of herself down, buried it so deep that she sometimes wondered if it had ever existed at all. But it had existed. It still existed. And now 40 people had witnessed its resurrection. Slowly, Betty opened her eyes and lifted her hands from the keyboard. The spell was broken, and she was just Betty again, the quiet cleaning lady in her simple black dress. But something had changed, something fundamental and permanent. She could feel it in her chest, in her hands, in the way her heart was beating. She turned around slowly to face the room, suddenly remembering where she was and what had just happened. She expected to see polite smiles, maybe a few nods of appreciation. What she saw instead took her breath away. 40 people were staring at her with expressions of complete amazement. Some were crying, some were shaking their heads in disbelief, and all of them looked like they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The silence stretched on, as if no one could find words for what they had just experienced. Betty felt her cheeks burning red. She had revealed herself completely, shown them the part of her that she had kept hidden for 3 decades. There was no taking it back now. They had seen who she really was, beneath the quiet exterior and humble manner. They had seen the musician she had once been and apparently still was. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like forever. Betty sat on the wobbly piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, looking at 40 faces that showed nothing but pure amazement. She had never been the center of attention like this before, and she didn't know what to do with it. Then, slowly, Paul started to clap. It began as a quiet, respectful applause, but within seconds, the entire room erupted into thunderous clapping. People were standing up, some of them wiping tears from their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The applause went on, growing louder instead of quieter. "Betty!" Dorothy called out over the noise, her voice thick with emotion. "My goodness, where did that come from?" Betty felt her cheeks burning as she stood up from the piano bench. Her legs were shaking, and she wasn't sure if it was from the performance or from the overwhelming reaction. She had expected polite clapping, maybe a few kind words. She hadn't expected this. I used to play a little," Betty said quietly, her voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "A little?" Frank's voice boomed across the room. "Betty, what we just heard wasn't a little. That was incredible. That was professional level playing." The applause finally began to die down, but people remained standing, their eyes fixed on Betty with new respect and wonder. She looked around the room at faces she had known for years, people who had smiled politely at her and made small talk about the weather. Now they were looking at her like she was someone completely different. Mrs. Chen was the first to approach her, tears still streaming down her face. "Betty, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You have an amazing gift. Where did you learn to play like that?" Robert asked, his gruff voice gentler than usual. "I've been to concerts at the City Theater, and I've never heard anything that moved me like that." Betty felt overwhelmed by all the attention. She wasn't used to people asking her questions about herself, wanting to know her story. For so many years, she had been content to fade into the background, to be helpful but unremarkable. Now everyone was looking at her with curiosity and respect. "I studied music when I was younger," Betty said softly. "But that was a long time ago." "How long ago?" Dorothy asked gently, sensing that there was more to the story. Betty looked around the room at all the expectant faces. These people had shared their evening with her, had welcomed her into their celebration. Maybe it was time to share a little of herself with them. "I was accepted to the New England Conservatory when I was 22, Betty said, her voice getting stronger. "I had a full scholarship. I was going to study piano performance." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people trying to understand how someone with that level of talent had ended up cleaning their community center. What happened? Paul asked gently. Betty took a deep breath. She hadn't told this story in years, hadn't even thought about it much. But standing here, with her heart still racing from the music she had just played, it felt like time to let it out. My mother got sick, Betty said simply. Really sick. And my father. Well, he didn't handle stress very well. My brother was still in high school. Someone had to stay and hold things together. The room was completely quiet now. Everyone understood. Without Betty having to say more, they could fill in the gaps of the story themselves. A young woman with incredible talent, faced with an impossible choice between her dreams and her family's needs. I thought I was just postponing things, Betty continued, her voice getting quieter. I thought maybe I could go to school later, when things settled down. But life doesn't work that way, does it? One thing led to another. I got married, had kids, got divorced. The piano got sold to pay for my daughter's surgery. And somewhere along the way, I just stopped thinking about music. Linda, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Betty, you never stopped being a musician. What we just heard proved that. You can't lose a gift like that. She's right, said George, the maintenance volunteer. That kind of talent doesn't just disappear. It was there all along, waiting. Betty looked around the room at all these people who had suddenly become so much more than just the volunteers she cleaned up after. They were looking at her with understanding and compassion, and something else she wasn't used to receiving, admiration. I can't believe you've been here all this time, Paul said, shaking his head. 8 years, and none of us knew. We've been sitting on hidden treasure and didn't even realize it. It's not hidden treasure, Betty said with a small smile. It's just old memories. Old memories? Dorothy laughed. Betty, what we just heard wasn't a memory. That was happening right now in the present. You didn't just remember how to play. You still know how to play. As the shock of the performance began to wear off, people started asking more questions. They wanted to know about her training, about the pieces she knew, about why she had never mentioned her musical background. Betty found herself talking more in one evening than she had in months, sharing stories about her childhood piano lessons, her high school music teacher who had encouraged her to audition for conservatory, and the pieces she had once dreamed of performing on stage. You know, said Janet, the librarian who had been quiet throughout the evening, my nephew works for the local newspaper. He's always looking for interesting human interest stories. Would you mind if I mentioned this too? Him. Betty felt a flutter of panic. Oh, I don't think that's necessary. It was just one song. Just one song? Frank laughed. Betty, you turned a broken piano into a concert hall. That's not something that happens every day. People should know about this, Mrs. Chun said earnestly. Not just for you, but for everyone. Your story could inspire people. There might be other folks out there who gave up on their dreams and think it's too late to get them back. Betty hadn't thought about it that way. She had always seen her story as one of loss and compromise, of dreams that didn't come true. But, looking around the room at these people who were so moved by her performance, she began to wonder if maybe there was another way to see it. I'm 52 years old, Betty said quietly. I haven't played seriously in 30 years. I work as a cleaning lady. I'm not exactly inspiration material. Are you kidding? Dorothy said, her eyes bright with excitement. Betty, you're exactly the kind of inspiration people need. You show that it's never too late, that dreams don't have to die just because life gets in the way. The conversation continued for another hour, with people sharing their own stories of dreams deferred and talents unused. Betty found herself at the center of it all, no longer the quiet woman in the background, but the person everyone wanted to talk to. As the evening wound down and people began to clean up, Betty found herself looking at the old piano with new eyes. It was still broken, still damaged and imperfect. But it had been enough. It had been enough to let her rediscover a part of herself she thought was lost forever. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to change everything. 3 days after the volunteer dinner, Betty arrived at the community center to find something that made her stop in her tracks. A small crowd had gathered around the old piano, and there were tools scattered on the floor nearby. Frank was on his knees, carefully working on the keyboard, while Paul stood over him giving directions. "What's going on?" Betty asked. Setting down her cleaning supplies, Dorothy looked up from where she was polishing the piano's wooden surface. Her face was bright with excitement. "We're fixing it. After what you did the other night, we couldn't just leave this beautiful instrument broken." "But I thought there was no money in the budget for repairs," Betty said, confused. "There wasn't," Paul said with a grin. "But funny thing happened. After Janet's nephew wrote that article about you in the newspaper, donations started pouring in. People who read the story wanted to help fix the piano." Betty felt dizzy. "What article?" Dorothy pulled out a folded newspaper from her purse. "You haven't seen it yet? It came out yesterday morning." Betty took the paper with trembling hands. There, on the front page of the local section, was a photo of her sitting at the piano. The headline read, "Hidden Talent, Local Woman's Piano Performance. STUNS Community." The article told the whole story: her scholarship to conservatory, the family circumstances that changed her path, and her incredible performance on the broken piano. "I can't believe this," Betty whispered, reading through the article. It was written with such kindness and respect, focusing not on what she had lost, but on the beauty of what she had shared that night. "Believe it," Frank said, looking up from his work on the piano keys. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing. People want to know more about you, about the piano, about what happened that night." Over the next few days, Betty's life began to change, in ways she never could have imagined. The local radio station called and asked her to do a brief interview. The morning talk show on the small local TV station wanted her to come on and play something. People she hadn't heard from in years reached out to her, having seen the article or heard about it from friends. But the biggest surprise came a week later, when Betty arrived at the community center to find the piano looking completely different. The keys had all been repaired or replaced. The wood had been refinished to a beautiful shine, and it had been properly tuned. There was even a small brass plaque on the front that read, "Restored with love by the Riverside community." "Go ahead," Dorothy said, noticing Betty staring at the transformed instrument. "Try it out." Betty sat down at the bench, which had also been fixed and no longer wobbled. She placed her hands on the keys and immediately felt the difference. Every key responded perfectly, producing clear, beautiful tones. She played a few scales, then launched into a piece by batch. The sound that filled the room was rich and full. Everything the old broken piano had never been able to produce. "It's perfect," Betty said, tears in her eyes. "No," Paul said quietly, "you're perfect. The piano is just finally good enough to match your talent." Word continued to spread about Betty's story and her musical ability. The local Arts Council invited her to perform at their annual fundraiser. A retirement home asked if she would come play for their residents. The elementary school where Betty worked as a custodian wanted to know if she would consider giving piano lessons to interested students. At first, Betty was overwhelmed by all the attention and requests. She had lived quietly for so long that being in the spotlight felt strange and uncomfortable. But as she thought about it more, she began to see the opportunities differently. "You know," she told Dorothy one afternoon as they sat in the community center, "I never thought about teaching before. But maybe that's something I could do." "Are you kidding?" Dorothy said. "You'd be an amazing teacher. You have the skill, the patience, and now everyone knows you have the heart for it too." Betty started small. She offered to give free piano lessons to a few children at the community center on Saturday mornings. Word spread quickly, and soon she had a waiting list of kids who wanted to learn. Parents were eager to have their children learn from someone. With Betty's background and obvious love for music, the children adored her. Betty had a gentle way of teaching that made even the most difficult concepts seem simple. She remembered what it was like to be young and excited about music, and she was able to share that excitement with her students. More importantly, she taught them that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about expressing yourself and finding joy in the process. "Mrs. Betty," said little Joey, one of her 7-year-old students, "when I play piano, I feel happy inside. Just like you do." Comments like that reminded Betty why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about performing for crowds or impressing people. It was about the pure joy of creating something beautiful and sharing that beauty with others. As the months passed, Betty's life settled into a new rhythm. She still worked as a custodian at the elementary school, but now she also taught piano. Lessons 3 afternoons a week and Saturday mornings. She had performed at several local events, always to enthusiastic audiences who had heard about the woman who could make broken pianos sing. The biggest change, though, was in Betty herself. The quiet woman who had tried to remain invisible for so many years was learning to accept compliments and attention with grace. She was rediscovering parts of her personality that had been buried under years of putting everyone else's needs first. "I feel like I'm becoming myself again," Betty told Mrs. Chun one day after a particularly good lesson with her students. "I had forgotten who I was before I became just somebody's mother, somebody's employee, somebody's caretaker." "You were always yourself," Mrs. Chun said wisely. "You just forgot to let yourself shine." One evening, as Betty was practicing on the restored piano, she played the same Chopin nocturne that had started it all. But this time, it sounded different. Not just because the piano was fixed, but because Betty was different. There was a confidence in her playing now that hadn't been there before. A sense of ownership over her own talent. As she played the final notes, Betty realized something important. She had spent 30 years thinking her story was about sacrifice and lost opportunities. But maybe it was really about something else entirely. Maybe it was about how dreams don't disappear. They just wait patiently for the right moment to resurface. She looked around the community center, at the piano that had been restored with so much love, at the photos on the wall from recent events where she had performed, at the schedule of her upcoming piano lessons posted on the bulletin. Bored. This wasn't the life she had planned when she was 22, but it was a good life. It was her life. Betty smiled and closed the piano lid gently. Tomorrow she would be back, teaching music to children who looked at her with the same wonder she had once felt when she first discovered the magic of piano keys. She would be sharing her gift, and in sharing it, she had found herself again. The broken piano had been fixed, but more importantly, something broken inside Betty had been healed, too. And that, she thought as she gathered her things to go home, was the most beautiful music of all.